All right. This is the American YAWP, Chapter 11, the Cotton Revolution. And so this chapter is a chapter that focuses primarily on the southern United States leading up to the American Civil War. And kind of an important point to make right here in the introduction is kind of what is the perception of what happened in the South leading up to the Civil War, and then the reality of what happened in the South leading up to the Civil War. And the perception is that while the North was progressing in terms of the technology and the economy and maybe even ideas, that the South was kind of like a stick in the mud and refused to change, and that is not true. We want to kind of make sure that we understand that, and again, we'll just kind of use these years, somewhat arbitrarily, but between, let's say, 1820 and 1860, the antebellum, referring to before the Civil War, antebellum, South did change, did change. Slavery was preserved. Right. So in terms of what did and didn't change, one of the big things is that slavery was not amongst, or at least the legality and the presence of slavery was not amongst the institutions. But the South did change, and so the idea that the North changed and the South was left in the dust, that's not entirely true. The North changed, and it changed very dramatically, but the South also changed as well. And there'll be a couple of kind of ways that we'll discuss these changes. First, though, and maybe the most obvious change, was the role that the South had in international trade. And the introduction to this chapter um, gives us a little bit of an idea of how the South or the American South is engaging with the broader economy, unlike it had done in the past. And this is all really kind of revolving around one single crop, and that crop is cotton, right? Cotton becomes kind of the key change in the South that really facilitates all other changes. So we might just say, in terms of expansion of international trade, we'll say the South, they became more interconnected in the global, essentially what international means, economy, became more interconnected in the global economy. And so, really, kind of the role or the piece that the South contributes to the rest of the globalized industrial economy is this commodity of cotton. And cotton becomes so valuable that it's sometimes referred to as white gold. So, what allowed this transformation to take place? And again, a kind of simplified way of kind of measuring the American economy is that, if you were to look at the time period of the Revolution, for example, all right, so this would be 1776. Primarily, the commodities that were grown and exported in the South consisted of tobacco and rice, right? Those were kind of the two major crops. By the time of the Civil War, which is 1860, it's cotton. And so it's the shift from tobacco and rice over to cotton that is kind of the fundamental change. And then again, kind of all these other changes are on top of that, including the increase in terms of the South's role in kind of global trade, right? Cotton becomes a more valuable commodity and maybe even a more globalized commodity. So, what led to this change, right? That is kind of a question that we might ask. Well, it's going to be a series of events that kind of create the circumstances which make this cotton boom possible. And you might think about it in terms of like all of the stars needed to align just right in order for cotton to really take over the entire southern economy in the United States. And that is true. So the first kind of star we might say, or the first kind of puzzle piece, is industrialization. And when we look at industrialization, the rise of the factory system, whether it's in Europe or in the northern United States, this was a way of producing or manufacturing at a much more efficient rate. So we might just say about industrialization is that it increased the potential manufacturing capacity. And we're just going to say in this case for textiles. A textile is just any kind of cloth made finished product. The textile could be a rug, it could be a tablecloth, it could be a shirt, it could be pants, it could be curtains, whatever it is. So, a crop like cotton had existed before. Cotton had always been around, but the amount of cotton you could grow was limited based off of how much one could manufacture, right? Think about the Industrial Revolution as going from, making stuff with your hands, right? Grandma sewing a pair of socks to making socks in the factory. Effectively, and these numbers aren't perfect, but the manufacturing or the ability to produce more is increasing by like 50 or 100 times. And so that's going to put pressure on, growers in the South to grow more cotton because it can now be manufactured even more. A second kind of star to make this cotton boom make sense is territorial expansion. Cotton in general requires land. And when you actually compare the southern United States to other kind of plantation societies that use slave labor, one of the things that makes the southern United States unique is that it is just far more larger in terms of territory. And so we could point to things like the Louisiana Purchase, for example, and see how that opened up the potential for more and more cotton to be grown. Whereas, let's say you compare it to someplace like Jamaica or Cuba or Haiti, some of these other plantations in the Caribbean, they don't have quite, not even quite as much. They don't have anywhere near as much land as the United States does. So the United States has the manufacturing capacity. It also has the ability for territorial expansion. Now, one kind of missing kind of component in this cotton boom was technology. It turned out that there were several bottlenecks that prevented really cotton from taking off. And one of them was the process of removing seeds. We might just say about technological innovation more broadly is that it helps, we'll say, with the maybe efficiency and speed cotton can, we'll say, be profitable. So in terms of technological innovations, the factory or the steam engine is one. We'll talk about transportation down here in a moment, but there really is kind of one big technological innovation that gets highlighted here, and that is Eli Whitney's cotton gin. Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. The cotton gin was a device that removed the seeds from cotton, we'll say 50 times quicker or faster, whatever term you want to use. So we got a couple of images of the cotton gin here. This is actually a image provided by your book. This is the cotton gin as it was sent to the patent office in 1794 when it was invented. There's another cotton gin here on display. And, one of the kind of bottlenecks in terms of manufacturing was removing the seeds. And an enslaved laborer could only remove the seeds of about one bale of cotton per day. It was very kind of tedious, right, to pick them all out by hand. The cotton gin was a device where you could put cotton in one side, you turn a crank, and as you turn the crank, these little, I don't know, I guess kind of fingers or brushes or whatever it was, will actually remove the seeds for you. And so now with the ability to remove seeds 50 times quicker, with essentially the United States, expanding its territory by 50 times larger, the ability to manufacture it 50 times more efficiently, you're kind of seeing how all of these other, all these things are aligning to really make cotton not just the dominant cash crop of the American South, but in some ways, the dominant cash crop of the entire United States. Other government policies like the Indian Removal Act, you can definitely look at this in terms of the sort of broader economic changes that are taking place. So, for example, in terms of the Indian Removal Act, this we might say allowed more land to be used for cotton. Now, that's not to say that the Indian Removal Act was passed by Congress entirely for the purposes of growing more cotton, but it is kind of fascinating that for 1830, since the United States was created in 1789 with the U.S. Constitution, that for about 40 years, groups like the Cherokee and the Creek and the Choctaw, they were recognized by the United States government as being able to sort of have possession over their lands. And then suddenly in 1830, all of a sudden Congress kind of gets up the urge to remove Native American populations. Does that have something to do with the growing cotton economy? Well, I would say that it certainly does. One other point that we'll make here about Eli Whitney that I want to touch upon before I forget about it was that the impact that the cotton gin had, and this was, of course, not Whitney's intention, but by, we might say, a device that removes the seeds 50 times quicker, has the side effect of requires 50 times more labor to grow, to harvest, right? Everything else, right, is required. So what's interesting about Whitney is that if you had to say, I mean, you could make an argument about this, but if you had to say which single person was most responsible for the expansion of slavery in the United States, you can make an argument it was Eli Whitney. Not just only him and his cotton gin, but again, if we wanted to kind of pinpoint it on one single person, because even though this was a device that might have made the task of removing the seeds easier for an enslaved individual, might have actually led to a kind of a better quality of life. The reality is that once that one individual can remove the seeds 50 times quicker, it just meant that more enslaved workers were required to grow it, to harvest it, all the other things that leading up to it. And so what we're going to see here is not just an expansion of the cotton industry, but also an expansion of slavery. And that is probably the most important kind of consequence of the shift to the cotton economy that we find in the American South. Other things that allowed for the cotton boom to happen was the availability of things like credits and loans, oftentimes even foreign or northern banks provided the loans for, say, the cotton boom. And this kind of brings up a good question, right? And this is something that certainly could be argument, but what sort of role do the free states, and to a certain degree, even in Europe, have in the expansion of slavery? Right. So this is kind of an interesting question because we think of the free states as being completely divorced from the South. There was no slavery in the North. There was slavery in the South. But when we consider the fact that a lot of the credits and loans were coming from northern banks, when we consider that a lot of transportation was financed by Northerners, when we think about the factories, many of the factories are in the free states. And so there are kind of varying opinions on this matter. Some would say that the North is just as guilty of perpetuating and expanding slavery. Others would say, no, it's not quite the same thing, right? The North has less of a role, but that is certainly kind of an interesting topic to explore. And the last kind of component in this, sort of stars aligning perfectly, we might say, is improvements in transportation. This includes things like steamships and trains. And again, just for the sake of simplicity, let's go ahead and kind of tally all of this up just to understand what's happening here. So Because of things like the Industrial Revolution and industrialization, the capacity to manufacture cotton products increases by 50 times, right? Grandma sewing her socks now to the sock producing factory. Territorial expansion gives the United States about 50 times more land to grow cotton, which is also required for this boom. Eli Whitney's cotton gin allows you to remove the seeds 50 times quicker. So again, we might think about this in terms of like, a manufacturing bottleneck, but now that bottleneck is alleviated. Credits and loans provide the proper finance that is required. Again, we'll just say 50 times more investments are available if cotton is that profitable. And with things like steamships and trains, the ability to transport cotton increases by 50 times. So all of these things are kind of pointing in one direction. And that one direction is, well, what does that mean about labor, right? What's going to happen now to labor? Once all of these things increase by 50 times, what it pretty much necessitates is that the amount of slave labor required to kind of fit all of these things is also going to increase by 50 times. Now, I just chose 50 times as a somewhat random number. It's not totally random. The cotton gin did allow for, removing seeds from 50 bales a day as compared to 1 bale a day in the past. But you can kind of understand the point here, right? That with all of these things lining up perfectly, it's going to lead to a dramatic increase in the amount of slavery in the South. And so when we say in some ways that the South didn't change before the American Civil War, that's not true. Yes, slavery remained legal, it remained present, it remained protected, but it increases dramatically, right? So much so that kind of sends the United States down this trajectory of what eventually becomes the Civil War. Of this cotton boom, a Mississippi lawyer remarked this was a quote unquote new El Dorado. El Dorado, if you're not familiar, these were the mythical, they ended up being somewhat mythical, I guess, although there were some true golden cities, although it wasn't El Dorado. This is the mythical golden city that Spain, we'll just say searched for, right? So the idea was that cotton had become so profitable that it was like discovering a golden city, right? These crops. And so just to give you an idea of the expansion of slavery, and we can get it purely through statistics. We got 1793, 1835, and 1865. Well, we'll hold off for slavery first, but we'll just look at cotton. And, with cotton comes the increase in slave labor. So in 1793, 5 million pounds of cotton was produced. By 1835, that had increased to 500 million pounds. And in 1865, it was 2 billion pounds of cotton being produced. So certainly as they appropriately call it, a cotton boom. All right, moving on to section 3, cotton and slavery. And the connection between the two, the major one, to say that with the transition over to a cotton economy came the growth of slavery, so the number of enslaved individuals increased, but also the expansion of it. And we should not kind of forget that aspect as well. We are presented here with a map showing us the counts of enslaved individuals in the United States by county, so counting county by county. The darker the county, meaning the higher number of enslaved individuals. And so by 1860, you can see that slavery has more or less congregated around two areas. One is kind of towards the tail end of the Mississippi River here, showing us the importance of transporting cotton out of the river, and also an area right here. Now, typically we refer to these areas as the Cotton Belt, or the Cotton Belt might be the term that you use to describe this particular part of the country. Your textbook uses the term Black Belt, which is also a term used to describe this area. And that is to kind of remind us that in a historical context before cotton, much of American slavery was centered around the Chesapeake Bay. In fact, in 1619, the first 20 enslaved Africans. In fact, your textbook actually uses the term quote unquote unfree rather than enslaved. Um, my guess is because by 1619, Virginia hadn't developed the slave codes yet or the laws that regulated slavery. And so, if you want to make a distinction between unfree and enslaved, you could do that, I suppose. But more often than not, we consider 1619 to be the year that slavery arrived in the North American English colonies, the first 20 enslaved Africans brought to Jamestown. And all during the English colonial period, it was really around the Chesapeake Bay here in Virginia that slavery thrived. Now, with the American Revolution came an opportunity to have state governments decide what their policies would be in regards to slavery. And so, when we talk about the American Revolution and the impact on slavery, it's one of those things where some things did change, but not all of them. We typically cite the American Revolution as not being radical enough to completely abolish slavery throughout the entire country, but it did kind of diminish slavery in a couple of key ways. And one was that after the American Revolution, states could essentially now decide on the legality of slavery. The American Revolution created a brand new country in the United States, so a brand new national government. But what it also created was 13 state governments, and each individual state could decide, were they going to allow slavery? For the most part, the northern states, we might say, opted for gradual emancipation of slavery. So in these northern states, slavery did exist at the time of the American Revolution. And so, as a way to kind of appease enslavers and guarantee them their property for the time being, slavery would exist in the short term, but in the long term, it would eventually go away. And more or less every single state above Pennsylvania opted for gradual emancipation. However, the southern states, they definitely opted for a preservation and also a protection of slavery. So the American Revolution got rid of slavery in half of the country, but not in the American South, where it would go on to flourish. And so with the cotton boom, right, once cotton kind of hit the scene and it became a lot more profitable due to all the things we talked about earlier, technological innovation, transportation, all those other things, the center of slavery shifted. It shifted from the Chesapeake down to the deep South. And so we see the growth in terms of the number of enslaved individuals, but also how it continues to spread further and further and further and further. So the cotton boom, we've already talked about this a couple of times, but we can go ahead and kind of put it down in words here. And the cotton boom is really just the rapid shift of the Southern economy to cotton, right? So much so that cotton becomes really the basis for the Southern economy in a lot of ways. And so statistically, we can measure this, right? With cotton boom came the growth of slavery. We got a couple of years here in terms of the population. We'll just population. In 1790, we're dealing with 650,000 enslaved individuals. By 1860, 4 million enslaved individuals reside in the United States. We might also think about the importance and growth of slavery, not in terms of just sheer numbers, but also in terms of price. Price usually kind of gives us an indication of what the demand is. And because cotton could yield such a high profit, the demand for enslaved laborers, the demand for land, all of these things went up. So we might consider this. And your textbook gives you a lot of different like statistics in terms of the rising prices, but we'll just focus on one here. This was the price of an enslaved child under 18. And depending on one's age and one's, sex, the price of an enslaved person kind of depended on those things. But for children, In 1820, it was about $100. By 1845, it had grown all the way to $600. So, whereas in earlier eras after the Revolution, you might have had something like a manumission, now because the demand for slavery was so high and the price was so much higher, um, it was you found that things like manumissions were much less common now with cotton, and it was much more common for enslavers to sell their enslaved workers to other plantations further and further and further south. As one English observer remarked, this is an English traveler to the South in 1857, he said, quote, slaves and cotton, cotton and slaves. These are the law and the profits to the men of the South, right? Cotton and slavery becoming so instrumental. Now, one thing that remained the same with the transition to cotton was the ways in which enslaved people resisted their condition. An important thing to note about resistance is that enslaved people resisted at all times, in all places. So just the fact that more people were now enslaved didn't change anything about the way that people resisted it. Just because slavery was now in, Arkansas and Louisiana and Texas, and it hadn't been there 30 years earlier, didn't change that either. Now, resistance comes in all different shapes and forms, and resistance could be done kind of on a much smaller scale. It could be done on a much larger scale. Now, your textbook identifies certain acts of resistance as quote unquote simple actions. You might also hear this be described as something like subtle defiance. I don't know if I'm spelling that right. Defiance, we'll just do it that way. Or silent sabotage. And subtle defiance, subtle sabotage, simple actions. This is essentially the day to day resistance. And it can range from anything like, faking illness, right? So pretending to be sick to not work. It can involve things like breaking tools, right? You quote unquote, as an enslaved individual, you accidentally break the tools as a way to sabotage the plantation. Or for enslaved women, this could be pregnancy. Pregnancy could be an escape from some of the more demanding labor that was required. Now, this was done again, kind of all places at all times, and it was, and oftentimes, kind of a back and forth to constantly be sabotaging the plantation system. Now, one kind of way or form of resistance that is worth noting here is running away. And your textbook does identify running away as kind of in the same vein as these simple actions, though I will kind of make the caveat when it comes to running away that this was, in many cases, the most effective form of resistance for reasons that are kind of very specific to the United States. So, in the United States, it's a very large area geographically. The United States, the free white population outnumbers the enslaved African population. So, while revolts did occur, and at the end of this chapter, we'll talk about a revolt in particular, running away proved oftentimes more effective as something like violent revolt. Now, as far as violent revolt goes, slave revolts in the American context were actually quite less common than you find in other kind of places or economies around the world, like the Caribbean, for example. But one thing that is definitely true is that the fear of a slave revolt was constantly in the minds and really the hearts of the enslaving class. That the fear of revolt, we could say, often motivated and shaped the behavior and actions of enslavers. There was this constant sort of trepidation, constant fear. Laws were made in order, kind of motivated by these fears. So even though we might say that, look, slave revolts didn't happen very often, and when they did happen, they usually failed. But what's very important is that the idea of the fear of revolt was always there. In fact, your textbook goes on to describe some of Thomas Jefferson's views on this. And Jefferson said, Jefferson, at least we'll say endorsed colonization. Remember, colonization is colonization. Colonization is ending slavery, but then taking that free black population and moving them outside of the United States to Africa. So this was an anti-slavery kind of position, but never with the intention for allowing those free individuals to live in the United States and actually separating them, colonizing them in Africa. And Thomas Jefferson endorsed colonization, we might say, because of a fear for, you might say, inevitable racial violence. And kind of that gives us maybe a little bit of an insight into the minds of the enslaving class who, again, very fearful of the violent repercussions that slavery could potentially come with. So while resistance remained the same, one thing that we can add up to the change category is the way in which people were bought and sold. And with cotton not just came the growth of slavery itself, but in fact the growth of the slave trade as an industry. So the internal slave trade, and we're going to make a very sort of specific point here, the domestic slave trade, this flourished with the rise of cotton. Right? In fact, the internal slave trade became the second most profitable industry in the South besides cotton. And they used to have sayings like, in the North, they trade books and furniture and clothing and all these other things. But in the South, the only thing that gets exchanged across state lines are people, right? In the South, they trade people. Now, cotton had a lot to do with this, but it also has to do with the fact that the United States also banned the transatlantic slave trade or the international, we'll say the transatlantic slave trade in 1808. And so this was a ban on the importation of African slaves to the United States. And this was part of the broader 3/5 compromise that was made at the Constitution. Remember that part of that compromise was to allow the enslaved population to count as 3/5 of a person. And so what Northerners worried about was that, well, if the South can count the enslaved population for the purposes of getting more votes in the Congress and getting more votes to the president, they didn't want to allow the South to just import millions and millions of enslaved individuals, just giving them more and more and more votes. So they said, look, we have to ban the importation. We have to ban the slave trade or the Atlantic slave trade coming in. However, let us not confuse that the ban on the importation of enslaved individuals has no effect on the actual exchange of slaves between the states, which at the time with the cotton boom absolutely flourished. Section 4, South and the City. And so one of the consequences of the South becoming much more engaged in international trade, primarily by exporting cotton, was that a lot of southern cities went through some pretty profound transformation. So we'll just say about the southern city, we'll say transformed as a result of, primarily exporting cotton, but in all the economic activity that it brought. So kind of two ways that we can measure this sort of change, I guess. One is in terms of population. And that is to say that many southern cities were very, very low in terms of population. but also began to grow pretty significantly. There are several examples that your textbook provides, but let's look at New Orleans. New Orleans ends up becoming probably the most important city in the South, and of all the cities in the South, you know, I think if you were to look at like the top 10 biggest cities in the United States, New Orleans was the only one that was in the South. It's right at the very end of the Mississippi River, so it ends up being very, very important. But in 1820, back when Andrew Jackson was defending it from the British, or around that time, New Orleans could boast a population of 27,000 people. By 1860, that had grown to 168,000. So certainly more, doubling a couple of times over. So as more and more cotton was, being kind of exported from the South, through primarily these port cities, kind of the economic activity that it created led to a lot more people moving there. And the second one is that, before cotton, and this is maybe true of the United States more broadly, although I don't know about the North, that these cities went from primarily importing stuff to exporting stuff. So they were, oriented in a fundamentally different way. So this transformation was, again, when we think about the South, we typically think of it as being kind of rural and full of cotton plantations and fields, and that's certainly true. But in some kind of specific areas, there was a lot of economic activity going on in some of these cities. Now, one thing that certainly kind of aided the transformation of the Southern economy was the steam engine and steam power. And this is largely connected to the greater changes happening in regards to transportation. So remember, steam power was used not just for trains, which is typically what we think about it as, but used for trains and steamboats and steamships. I don't technically know the difference between a steamboat and a steamship, although I do for whatever reason remember that a steamboat is something that is on a river and a steamship is something that's on the ocean. But never mind. Steamboats and steamships were very important because, before that, the South, had contained a lot of rivers. And this is just true of the interior of the United States more broadly. But you were very much kind of limited in the way that you could utilize rivers in the sense that you could only go the direction that the river was going. The steamboat and the steamship, or steam power more broadly, meant that for the first time, this is really why it becomes significant. For the first time, ships or boats, whatever term you prefer, could is it still sailing? Right? If you have a boat that doesn't have a sail, you're still sailing. Who knows? Right? For the first time, ships and boats could sail against the river, and we can think about it in terms of transportation, right? Every single waterway or every single river was one way. They now became two ways. And the best example of this is the Mississippi River. And before the invention of the steamship or the steamboat, you could really only sail down the Mississippi River. And even that was pretty dangerous. But thanks to the steamship, we might say, thanks to steam power, the Mississippi River, we'll say, became a center of economic activity. So not only could you export cotton out, but now with the steam boat, you can sail ships in and perhaps even bring things like like various commodities, right? Consumer goods if they were to do that. So the Mississippi becomes a very important, and this is true of every river, right? Every river like doubles in terms of its importance because now there's kind of a completely new way of getting goods from point A to point B that are unlocked, right? Rivers can be sailed up and they can be sailed down. Now, as far as social class goes, when we think about the American South and the antebellum period, there are primarily two classes, or three classes, we should say, in society in the South. The first one is the landowning elite classes. And we might even make a subsection of here, and that is the enslaving class, right? The slave owning class. This would have been a class that is in very, very small numbers. Typically, not only do they own land and own enslaved individuals, but they're also into politics, right? When we think about presidents and Supreme Court judges and senators and stuff like that, it's from this class. And then the other class might be described as the working, but probably more appropriately in the South, the farming poor, right? These are individuals that maybe they have some land, but they don't own any slaves. They don't have the financial means to do that. And for the most part, you can kind of divide Southern class into those categories. Of course, the third category is the class of enslaved individuals. So there are enslaved people, there are the enslaving political elite, and then there's the working or farming poor, kind of the yeoman farmer that Thomas Jefferson thought of. But your textbook does make the point that because of the economic activity that is existing in the South, especially in American cities, that there was enough economic activity to say that a small Southern middle class, which is typically not present in the rural part of the South, but a small Southern middle class could and did exist in Southern cities. Section 5, Southern cultures. So, culture more broadly is something that we use to describe kind of the intangible things. Um, it's something that you might not be able to pinpoint, but it certainly exists and it certainly has an impact on history. If we were just going to define culture kind of broadly, we might say this is like something like a belief system. It could be something like attitudes, stereotypes, right? Beliefs, attitudes, stereotypes, expectations that kind of shape people's behavior. And, culture exists pretty much anywhere you can find people at any time in history. And the same thing is true of the American South. So, beginning with the culture of enslaved individuals, we can see that, or we can say that enslaved people developed a unique culture despite the, the oppression of slavery. And what we could point to, there are a couple of examples or areas we can kind of point to in terms of identifying what that culture is. Culture would refer to anything like family, maybe even something like trade or exchange networks. Language is typically a pretty good indication of culture, developing not just in terms of like, languages like Spanish or English or stuff like that, although that's true, but just a specific way of talking to one another, and religion. And probably times, religion is kind of the most clear indicator of culture, or religion is maybe the most simple place to look. So, for those that were enslaved in the United States, family networks, trade, language, religion, all of these things certainly existed and were very important. Now, we'll look at two of these things in a little bit more detail to see how the transformation in the South ended up having an impact. So, the first one we could look at is family, and family was very, very important because family helped to maintain a sense of identity, right, of who one was. That was, to be a mother, a father, a brother, a sister, all those things were very much important. Another way, especially true in the system of slavery, and this might be unique to enslaved individuals, is that family was a vehicle, or we'll say cultural preservation. And a great example of this is some things like the names of children. And so, how would the culture of enslaved population be passed down from generation to generation to generation? Well, through family lines and things like naming of children could be an example of that. Another example of this is in the realm of marriage. And even though marriages were not legally recognized in most states, at least for enslaved individuals, it's not to say that they didn't happen. They certainly did. And marriage served as a vehicle to maintain ethnic identity. Many of those who married each other sought partners that were of the same African ethnicity, and also to build nuclear households. Right? And that was also true of most marriages amongst enslaved people, was that they included nuclear families. Nuclear essentially means, if you're not entirely familiar, it typically means two parents plus children. More specifically, a wife, husband. Whereas, for example, something like a polygamous marriage would not be considered nuclear, or an extended family, where grandma, grandpa, cousins, stuff like that, would not be considered nuclear. Nuclear is very much just wife, husband, and children, and this was the case for most families of enslaved individuals at the time. So, all throughout the years, family, marriage, right? These provided kind of very vital institutions of maintaining ethnic identity, maintaining identity more broadly, preserving culture. However, as the cotton boom unfolded, it put a serious amount of stress on not just enslaved individuals and their families, but on culture more broadly. So, one of the things that the cotton boom did was it increased the amount of enslaved people being bought and sold. And they used sort of a shorthand term to describe when somebody was sold, an enslaved individual was sold to another plantation. That was quote unquote downriver. This was a term to describe being sold from one place to another during the cotton boom. And this was less common before cotton because slavery was more or less just in the Chesapeake Bay around Virginia. And you had generation after generation after generation of enslaved individuals that might just be on one single plantation. But as soon as cotton began to spread further and further and further west, it meant that families were being sold at a much higher rate, and people were being sent, quote unquote, down the river. And this, of course, put a tremendous amount of stress on, on the lives of those individuals, and also on, efforts to maintain or preserve cultural identity. So this was something that was very much unique in the American context, right? Other slave societies like the Caribbean, the sugar plantations, didn't have the same expansion of slavery like the United States did. So what can we say about it? Well, one of the impacts was that families were broken up, right, at a much higher rate than what had been previously. So, for example, about 25% of all marriages ended via the via sale, right, or downriver. So these very important cultural institutions like families and like marriages, those are now being threatened by the cotton boom, right? It's certainly making matters worse, and it's making it harder to preserve, kind of stories passed on from generation to generation to generation. The downriver phenomenon, or the expansion of cotton, also gave enslavers more power, gave enslavers, say, more control due to the threat of sale. right? Do what I say, or I'll sell your family member, which was a different type of threat than the types of physical punishments that already existed at the time. Um, so, despite these pressures, despite the pressure of the cotton boom, families being broken up, marriages ending, uh, threatening people for sale, enslaved culture did continue to exist despite kind of all of these obstacles. And kind of a good indication of just how detrimental and important some of this stuff was is that by the time the American Civil War ended and slavery was abolished, a lot of kind of a lot of what enslaved people do upon emancipation is go looking for lost family members, right? Not having forgotten when such and such family member was sold away, 10, 20, or 30 years before emancipation. The fact that so many people did that as their first priority only kind of proves that the family was of utmost importance. Now, the types of threats that enslaved men and enslaved women faced were not always identical. In fact, the threats that enslaved women faced could be very much unique to their condition or circumstance. Now, one important point to make is that oftentimes the division of labor did not apply to enslaved men and enslaved women like it did to the broader American society. So, men and women, we're talking about enslaved men and enslaved women, were expected to do the same work. That was, plantation, field work, right, in most cases. So, whereas we learned with the rest of American society, we have this quote unquote cult of domesticity. This exists in the North and the South. And this is the idea that, it's really, only the men should be doing kind of the public, difficult labor. And, women have this sort of place in society as keepers of morality. And they really shouldn't kind of leave the home. This sort of idea of a gender division of labor did not apply to enslaved individuals. If you were an enslaved woman, that did not save you from kind of the most difficult type of work there was. On top of that, being an enslaved woman also meant that you were more often subjected to sexual violence and rape. And your textbook illustrates just how dire um, these circumstances can be. It tells the story of an enslaved woman, Celia, who was 19 years old. And she was someone who had been repeatedly raped by her enslaver. Celia eventually killed her master or killed her enslaver and killed her rapist. Upon killing him, she was then executed for murder. So even after taking matters into her own hands, she was determined to be guilty of murder, really no regard with what happened to her, and she ended up being executed for that action. All right, last section here, section 6, religion and honor in the slave South. So religion is typically kind of a good indication of culture. This is kind of one of the markers of it. And much like in other parts of the country in the antebellum era, religion was growing in popularity, and that was thanks to the Second Great Awakening, which resulted in more religiosity, right? More people attending church and subscribing to the Bible, and also brought in a more diverse, sort of array of worshipers, more diverse, say, church members. This would include, white and black, enslaved and free. This was true in the South as well. And early on, some of these churches that were inspired by the Second Great Awakening actually were biracial. Now, well, one, were biracial and could at times attack slavery, using the message of of God and equality in the eyes of God, and kind of those reasons as to why Christian theology could be understood as being anti-slavery. However, though, the era of the biracial congregation, the era of a Christianity that is really kind of frontally attacking slavery, as slavery becomes more important, these things become more rare and more rare. And instead, what we find is a type of Christianity that does more to maybe defend slavery than it does attack it. The congregations become more segregated as time goes on. So we might just kind of make that point that um, congregations became more segregated and supported slavery as cotton they spread. So, for example, a pro-slavery type of Christianity would emphasize aspects of the Bible that would make slavery seem like it was okay. So you can find certain kind of scriptures or anything like that in order to kind of set a certain message. So, for example, you might look in the Bible for any kind of scripture that refers to something like obedience, right? The Bible does talk about the virtue of obedience. You might look at the Bible for kind of the parts that say, well, this life is tough, but you do all the right things and you're going to go to heaven. So kind of endure this in the meantime, but don't worry when you die, there's, heaven on the other side there. So, depending on what your goal was, if your goal was to support slavery, you can pick and choose parts of the Bible that certainly do that. But perhaps one of the more effective ways to ensure that the message of Christianity supports slavery is just simply prohibit anyone from actually reading the Bible, because there tends to be stuff in there that is quite contrary to what those perpetuating slavery would want to advocate. So anti-literacy laws were created mostly in part to ensure that those enslaved individuals could not read the Bible for themselves and kind of get to the more the parts of the Bible that are anti-slavery. And so by the time that we get to the American Civil War, most African Americans, enslaved and free, do adhere to Christianity. Part of that is because the enslaver class does want to convert their enslaved population to a certain degree, especially earlier on, and especially kind of in the in sort of the frenzy that is the Second Great Awakening. But as time goes on, it's not just about a forced conversion. I mean, to some degree, you could say that enslaved people were forced to convert to Christianity, but the reality is that there's a lot of messaging in Christianity that was especially relevant and had an appeal amongst those who were enslaved. So we might say about anti-slavery Christianity, this would have been the type of Christianity embraced by the enslaved population. So, for example, you can look no farther than the story of Moses as an example. So, for enslaved individuals that adhered to Christianity, it wasn't so much Jesus Christ that was the central figure. It could have been someone like Moses, who, of course, is known for having, freed the slaves or led the slaves out of Egypt. You could also look at other sort of verses of God's words. Again, this would tie to this point about the literacy laws. If one managed to read and write and read the Bible for yourself, there are plenty of parts where God's words contradict slavery. The notion of equality in the eyes of God, good versus evil. All of these things were applicable. So, yes, there was a desire to convert enslaved African Americans to Christianity, but there was a lot of messaging in Christianity that was especially relevant and would eventually be embraced. So again, it's both Christianity, but depending on how one picks and chooses the types of scripture to adhere to, It could be used to support slavery, or it could be used to advocate against it. We have a quote here from William Brown, someone who had been formerly enslaved, at least his opinions on what he thought about the role of Christianity and the system of slavery in the South. He says, quote, slaveholders hide themselves behind the church. William Brown, formerly enslaved, 1850. Now, this desire or this emphasis on converting enslaved populations evaporated very, very quickly after 1831. And Nat Turner's revolt can kind of show us kind of both sides to this Christianity slavery relationship. Nat Turner's revolt on the face is the bloodiest slave revolt in American history. It resulted in the killing of 57 white individuals, men, women, and children, but also resulted in a backlash that saw the killing of hundreds of enslaved individuals for revenge and retribution. In terms of pure body count and in terms of the number of people who killed, bloodiest in American history. Now, what's maybe kind of relevant here to Nat Turner is that Nat Turner was inspired by Christianity. He was very much familiar with the message of Christianity, and in part, it was used to fuel his revolt. He was especially drawn to the parts that talked about, the end of days and how good would fight evil. And in his revolt, he believed that he was doing, in some sense, God's work. Now, Nat Turner's revolt was ended, much like many revolts in American history. It was not successful. Like I mentioned, Nat Turner and his group murdered 57 people. The militia eventually caught up with those participating in Turner's revolt, killed all of them. Turner himself was eventually captured and executed. And then there was kind of a widespread purge, we might say, of any and all enslaved African Americans and even some free blacks in the area that were either accused of knowing about the revolt or, having had some sort of role in it, right? So either they were executed or they were banished to other parts. And so the consequences of Nat Turner's revolt shows us kind of a very common theme that we find in the United States when it comes to slave revolts, and that is no, they're not successful in achieving emancipation for those who participate, but they are successful in getting sort of a very strong backlash. So, for example, following Nat Turner's revolt, we see a host of anti literacy laws. So, the idea that Christianity and the message of Christianity is dangerous. So, a lot of tightening after these revolts. Another example is that in certain areas, black congregations, right, so black churches, were banned for fear of any type of congregation inspiring some sort of revolt like Nat Turner. And you can see how it was depicted in the newspapers of the day, a horrid massacre in Virginia, 1831. Laws banning the number of enslaved, not even enslaved individuals, laws banning the number of African Americans that can be in one area at once, right? A lot of those types of laws were passed. So Nat Turner's revolt kind of shows us the way that, at least very, very, very directly, the message of Christianity could be anti-slavery. Now, as far as the rest of Southern society goes, there are some kind of cultural differences that we can mark between the South and the North. One thing that we might think about when it comes to the North and Northern culture is that Northern culture becomes, I don't want to say obsessed, but certainly kind of engulfed by consumption. The rise of the trains, the rise of the factory system. People in the North are sort of buying all of these commodities. And so there tends to be a more materialistic North because they have access to these things. Also, we might say kind of a more of a national culture. Northerners, because they are trading with each other, They're more likely to kind of read the same newspapers and visit other states. Whereas in the South, the lack of factories does not have a lot of consumption going on, so people aren't really buying stuff. The lack of trains or transportation doesn't mean that a national culture is developing. So the question is, well, if in the North, if they're developing a national culture and a materialistic culture, what type of culture exists in the South? And the answer is, for the most part, a culture based off of honor. We might say that honor or maybe chivalry remain, we'll say, very important ideas in the South. And if someone, or let's say, insults your honor or insults your family name, that matters a lot, and it's expected that you defend that. And probably the best symbol of this is the duel, right? And the duel is kind of this, say, older practice of defending one's honor with violence, right? So something like honor was important enough that you were expected to use violence in order to defend it, right? Your name, your reputation, right? Those things were worth defending. And in those days, by the time we're getting to the 1800s, dueling often involves just standing 10 feet away from each other and shooting pistols until one person dies. Famously, of course, Andrew Jackson was a duelist. And so even some of the highest members of the American political elite from the South engaged in dueling. So those things continue to be important. Now, another similarity we might draw with the North is that a cult of domesticity continued to exist for the free population in the South. And remember, the cult of domesticity is very much this gendered division of labor, that for the men, it's expected that they engage in the public arena. For women, it's expected that they engage in the domestic arena. And maybe one kind of point that we'll just make here is that, for Southern women, and this has maybe less to do with the cultural norms and more to do with the landscape, we'll just say they did not participate in reform movements. Because remember, in the North, reform movements allowed for an opportunity for women to kind of break the barrier into the public arena. Well, a lot of the reform movements like public schooling and drinking and labor laws, those were things or changes that the South wasn't necessarily going through. And so Southern women did not participate in reform as much. And as a result of that, you might be able to say that the cult of domesticity was um, therefore maybe stronger.